this may be a slightly weird question, but is there any, a lot of the time when people are coming up with these patents, it's to cover kind of risk, right, of the investment. But in this case, these things, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I feel like they're fairly sure bets in terms of when you look at the academic literature. But is there a risk that, one scenario I can imagine would be, say Compass gets this kind of monopoly on patents for synthesized psilocybin delivered through clinics, but then, as often happens in the states, where the states kind of, set the way for what can often happen at the federal level. Say at a federal level, they decide to adopt something like what happened in Oregon, and now therapists are allowed to use, organically grown, just normal natural mushrooms, instead of having to go through this route. Is there a possibility that at some point down the line, these companies could end up basically failing, where there's just a cultural shift that means that they're no longer relevant? Their mode of delivery isn't relevant and profitable.
Well, I think it's, I don't know that it's going to be that they fail entirely. Like, for instance, my parents know that I enjoy psychedelics, and I've had mushrooms, for instance, around them, and like, I don't think, however, that they would be interested in kind of experimenting with them themselves. I feel like if they had the opportunity, rather, to go to a clinic where they could get a synthesized psilocybin compound from somebody who they knew passed, some specific set of, very particular like requirements, that they were, clinically trained psychologist, or an MD and a psychiatrist, I think that's going to make them much more comfortable. So I think, there may still be people who, for that reason, or maybe for insurance purposes, if these are approved medicines and insurance covers them, maybe that's going to create the opportunity. But certainly, I mean, just going back to like what we talked about before, about how that's a concern that we would think Compass may have about like there being legalization in Oregon. I mean, if many states allow people to get, psilocybin assisted therapy just by having natural mushrooms, I mean, I think given the difference in cost, that's certainly going to be an option that many people are going to take. I mean, I would certainly rather do that, I think. And I think that will also open up more avenues for kind of experimentation in how these are delivered. So for instance, in Oregon, I think it may be possible to have like group therapy, but I don't know that like that would be something that would be very easy or even possible through the FDA. I think MAPS was like trying to figure out if that was something that the FDA would ever approve, group therapy or like couples therapy. But so there may even be avenues that people can take to specific types of psychedelic assisted therapy that, wouldn't even be part of an FDA approved sort of process. But yeah, I mean, I do think that every state that goes, that allows a legalized framework, as more and more of those become possible, that's, less and less for the medicalization route. I mean, there's, obviously there's going to be a very big market, I think, for this, as the kind of fallout of the coronavirus pandemic and the ongoing mental health sort of crisis. But that universe is still limited in size. So, but I mean, my hope, of course, is that there's real diversity in how these are delivered. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we'll see lots of states have campaigns similar to Oregon, and even broaden them beyond just psilocybin, because it's a way that psychedelics can not just kind of transform mental health care delivery, but really like mental health care and healthcare itself, and even go beyond kind of healthcare to being used to just benefit people spiritually or creatively, or Bob Jesse's betterment of well people, I guess, would always come to mind.
And I'm very interested as to what your ideal kind of picture of what the space might be like in future. You mentioned diversity. Do you think that's the kind of ideal thing, where there's lots of different routes to access these things?
Yeah, I mean, that would be my hope, because I think the potential for psychedelics is far beyond just what a taking one compound or taking a handful of compounds through FDA approval for specific clinical indications, even if they're used ultimately off-label. So I think there needs to be space for people to explore how to use them and the different ways. And I think we're still going to see that. I mean, now people are looking at different ways of combining digital tools, and I'm sure in a year or two people are going to be wearing all kinds of EEG headsets and have all kinds of different AI connected devices and biosensors and biofeedback and generative music. And there's going to be a real flourishing, whether it comes from the sort of more standard medicalization route or not. But yeah, I mean, I think this has been an area where people have been already experimenting. I mean, after I had my first psychedelic experiences in college, I think I was so obsessed. I spent 6 months reading everything on Arrowwood. So that you can imagine that the space for experimentation with these is enormous, and it's only going to get bigger and bigger once more states decriminalize and more people are able to talk about these things openly and practice these things openly.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine a huge culture shift, a big explosion in interest in the mainstream. And you mentioned early on active in the cannabis space. Are there interesting differences or parallels in how things have unfolded over recent years with cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, I think cannabis probably offers a lot of sort of warnings to psychedelics, because I don't know how many people look around at the cannabis space now and think that was kind of the optimum situation that they would have wanted had they set out to build something. I mean, both because there's still a lot of ongoing issues around equity, also because even people who are interested in it as just an investment opportunity lost a lot of money, and it's not done really well there either. But I think that the situation in cannabis is not really one to be repeated, and that's a whole podcast itself, because there's so many differences in different states and how they've approached things. But I hope, and I know that people are in the psychedelic space who are thinking about legalization, decriminalization efforts are pretty conscious of kind of what happened in cannabis and what went wrong in cannabis, and trying to avoid those mistakes. So I'm hopeful at least some of them won't be repeated. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting parallels. I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences too. I mean, we're not going to see, at least right away, I don't think, on every, at least in San Francisco, it feels like in my neighborhood, on every street corner there's a shop I can go into and get a branded box of THC gummies. I don't think it's going to be quite like that right away with psychedelics, but
yeah,
we'll see down the road.
And you mentioned at the start Psilocybin Alpha and this patent tracker that's been set up there. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Psilocybin Alpha is, it's a resource that Josh Hardman, who's the founder and editor of it, started. And my patent chart, the psilocybin one, actually just kind of came to his attention because it was I think I posted it in a Twitter thread, and it was indexed by Google. And then he reached out to me and asked if it would be okay to post it. And I said, yeah, it would be fine, which was probably the best decision I've made, because kind of our relationship just as friends and as colleagues has been a really important one to me, both kind of understanding the space and being involved in it. But part of my interest in making sure those trackers are there have been because, both out of my own curiosity, it's been really interesting to see this sort of explosion in patent applications. But I think it is a conversation that I'm, like I said, I'm glad we're having it, but I think it's a necessary one for people to kind of understand how ownership rights may start to crystallize in this space.